everybody. Today we're going to talk about chapter 1 of the textbook, and I'm just going to cover some key points from the chapter. I'm not going to give a lecture on the entire chapter. So today what I'm going to cover is the first half of the chapter. I want to talk about the functions of communication, and I want to talk about the characteristics of communication. So let's first start with the functions. So there are three functions that we want to talk about, and the first one is that we use communication to express affiliation. And what that means is we communicate to show our feelings that we have towards other people. So, how we want to show how we feel connected to other people, how we show our like, our dislike, our respect, our love towards other people. We do that through how we talk to somebody, through the words that we use when we're talking to somebody, through how we, touch other people, like hand holding or hugging or putting our arms around someone or standing further away from them. All of those different communicative acts express affiliation. So that's the first function of communication. The second function of communication is achieving goals. So we communicate to be able to accomplish particular objectives. So whether it's to understand something better, whether it's to get a job, or if it's to order a meal at a restaurant, whatever it is, we're usually trying to accomplish something when we are communicating with other people, right? We want to be understood, very minimum. So when you are communicating to achieve a goal, some people are pretty straightforward, right? They'll tell you what they're trying to accomplish. While some people communicate to achieve goals in different ways, like bullying is a way, or indirectly, like being sort of passive aggressive or guilt tripping. All of those ways are ways that people communicate to try to achieve some sort of goal. So your roommate um, is trying to get you to clean the kitchen, for example, but they don't want to just ask you directly because that would be too difficult for them. So instead, they are like more passive aggressive about it. They comment on how dirty the kitchen is, or they slam all of the doors in the kitchen, all of the cabinet doors, and like huffing and puffing until you figure out that something is upsetting them, and then you ask them and you get into an argument about it. So you can go about achieving goals in different ways. And then finally, the last function is to influence other people. So when we are communicating, we're not necessarily, we don't decide all of the time, like, okay, I'm going to influence this person, but often we just are influencing other people. And it's dependent on like the control that you have in the relationship. So, like the example that the book gives is that like you start a new job, and you're being trained by someone else who has been there for longer than you. They have more control in that relationship, and so they have more influence over you, right? They're teaching you how to do different things, and you're listening to them and taking advice from them. But as you get more comfortable and get more knowledgeable about how the job works, then they have less control and less power, so they're influencing you a little less, right? And so it's not that it's like a power struggle or anything. It's like this negotiation that you two, decide upon in the relationships because of the nature of that relationship. Okay, so those are the functions of communication. We have expressing affiliation, achieving goals, and influencing others. So now let's move on to the characteristics of communication. So let me get the book here because I wanted to give an example from the book for this part. So the first characteristic is that language is symbolic. So symbols are arbitrary constructions that refer to people, things, or concepts. So let's see. Another way to explain this is that the constructions, these arbitrary meaning that there is no sort of inherent meaning that we decide upon, we agree as a culture or as a couple to give a particular symbol a particular meaning. Um, so let's see, let me see a good way to explain this. So if, for example, it being symbolic, right? When you greet somebody, instead of saying like hello or something like that, you smile and nod. And it's, let's see, it's agreed upon what the meaning of those actions between the two of you are communicating. Another example would be like between like fraternities and sororities, sports teams, different social groups have different symbols, right? So think about like the letters of a fraternity or sorority, or the insignia of a social group, things like that. Those have meanings that aren't inherent to that symbol, but as a group, the group has decided what that symbol symbolizes or means to that group of people. So another example that would be is easy to understand is like if you think of like a best friend or a sibling or a romantic partner that you often have like a symbol to one another, whether it's like a handshake or a certain look or a gesture that you do that you've agreed upon what the meaning of that symbol is. But people who aren't part of that group or aren't part of that relationship, they don't understand what it means. As an outsider, it doesn't have the same meaning to them as it does to you. So that's the first, that communication is symbolic. The second characteristic is that it requires a shared code. So we encode and decode messages. So encoding means that we take in messages that are sent to us and we make sense of them. So what does that? We are taking something in and making sense of it, figuring out how to understand it, and then excuse me, I said that wrong. That is actually decoding. When we're decoding a message, we are taking in a message that's being sent to us. Like when we're in a conversation with someone, we are decoding what they're telling us. So we're taking in what they're saying and we're making sense of it, right? Like how does it apply to us? Do we understand what they're saying? So that's decoding. Encoding is when you are figuring out like how to communicate that message to an audience. So you're figuring out what words you want to use to communicate. You're figuring out what nonverbal gestures, like how your facial expressions, how you want to position your body, right? How you want to use hand movements, all of those things. That's you're encoding a message. So you have to have a shared code, right? Like you have to be able to understand one another's language in a way to be able to encode and decode messages. So, a very simple example would be if you speak a different language, right? You don't have a shared code, so it's difficult for you to understand, to be able to communicate. Another example would be like, say, a sports team. So they have like certain symbols, like hand symbols, that they use to be able to communicate with one another on a team, but it's only known to the people on the team, so outsiders can't interpret it, right? So the team members have a shared code, but outsiders aren't able to interpret it. Okay, so the next characteristic is that communication is linked to culture. So culture consists of shared beliefs, values, and practices of a group of people. So culture sort of helps to determine the language that we use, the symbols that we use, and what value we place on the symbols that we use, as well as what is appropriate behavior within that culture. So things like race, religion, age, political affiliation, gender, sexual orientation, economic status, educational level, occupation, all of those things help to make up our culture and what is accepted as what we sort of understand as accepted in the culture versus like not accepted. So, for example, a lot of European countries, when you greet one another, you might kiss, or, you know, in French culture, you kiss on both cheeks, even if it's a stranger, oftentimes. Whereas in the United States, we shake hands, right? So when you're meeting somebody for the first time. So it would be, you know, sort of jarring to you if you were introduced to somebody and they just came up and kissed you without you knowing them, right? Because the culture sort of dictates our behavior and how we communicate. So it the culture that we're from influences the way that we communicate. So that is that one. And then the next one is that communication doesn't have to be intentional. So we're communicating all the time, whether we're meaning to or not. So we communicate sometimes by eye contact, by blushing. Like if we get embarrassed, we're trying not, like, we might blush without even knowing that we are, or maybe we do know, but we're trying not to, but we do anyway. Um, you know, if you're in class and you fall asleep, that's communicating to the teacher that you're bored or you're really tired. The way that you hold yourself, all of those things are communicating whether you are intentional about it or not. So you're never not communicating, okay? Um, then the second to last one is that communication occurs through various channels. So you all are familiar with this concept. We communicate in conversations with one another. We communicate via email, via text message, you know, on the telephone. People used to communicate over fax machine, over smoke signals, you know, snail mail, all of these different ways that we communicate, and the channel that we're communicating through sort of influences the way that we communicate. So we use sort of different language when we're texting than we do when we're speaking one-on-one with one another. And finally, the last characteristic is that communication is transactional. So it involves two or more people. There's a sender and a receiver. The receiver is decoding a message. The sender is encoding a message. And it is, and you'll read about this when you talk about when the book discusses the transactional model. The conversation is always influenced by the the relational context, so the relationship that the people have with one another, the situational context, meaning the situation that they find themselves in, and then the cultural context, meaning, you know, what culture each one of them is coming from, and the culture in which they are communicating. So all of those things are always influencing communication. Okay, so that is just a little bit of a lecture on the functions and the characteristics of communication. Please be sure to read about the different models of communication. I want you to be able to I want you to make sure you understand those. And then once you've watched this, once you've read the chapter, then move on to the discussion board and write about the questions, okay? All right, I will talk to you all soon. Bye.